In a world that moves too fast, where money talks loud and patience whispers, we invite you to slow down. This isn't another get-rich guide. It's not about urgency or action. It's a quiet conversation with one of the most timeless books in investing, The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. Tonight we'll walk through its ideas slowly, one story at a time. Stories about markets and emotions, about bridges and shadows, and the difference between noise and wisdom. If you find peace in content like this, if slow learning, deep thinking, and soft storytelling help you wind down, feel free to subscribe, only if it feels right for you. No pressure, just presence. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Investment versus Speculation. The Man with the Lantern and the Wind. In a quiet village, nestled between rolling hills and silent lakes, there once lived an old man known only as Elias. He walked every evening with a brass-handled lantern in one hand and a thick notebook under the other. While others settled in for supper or leaned into loud conversation, Elias would stroll the outer paths of the village. Along the dry stone fences, the wildflower edges, the places where silence hummed. To the curious, Elias had a strange reputation. "He's searching for gold," one boy said once. "He's mapping a treasure," claimed another. But the truth was softer. Elias was neither wealthy nor eccentric. He was simply careful. Each evening he marked the direction and force of the wind, the color of the sunset, and the behavior of the animals around the nearby stream. He observed, he recorded, and he waited. You see, decades earlier, Elias had nearly lost everything. As a young man flush with excitement and advice from others, he had planted nearly every coin he had into a scheme promising great returns, a new railway venture that boasted of expansion, silver, and speed. There were banners, there were charts, there were powerful men saying all the right things. And for a time it worked. The value rose. People whispered in taverns about how lucky Elias had been. Some even followed suit. But like a tide pulled by a distant moon, it changed. The railway failed. Not because the idea was unsound, but because the promises had raced ahead of the planning. Elias lost most of what he owned, not in one moment, but in a slow fading like sunlight slipping from stone. He never spoke bitterly of it, but from then on he walked with his lantern, and he watched. There is something deeply human in the way we chase excitement, in markets, in relationships, in ideas. The flicker of "what if" becomes a fire. That fire is what Benjamin Graham warned of in the very first lesson of The Intelligent Investor. That gentle yet firm distinction between investing and speculating. Speculation is easy to recognize in hindsight. It is a bet dressed in confidence. It wears the language of profit, but lacks the grounding of principle. It is the man planting seeds in dry earth because he heard someone shout, "Harvest!" Graham defined investing as something simple and often overlooked. It is when, after careful analysis, you place your capital in a place where your principal is likely safe and your return is adequate. Not thrilling, not explosive, adequate. In modern times, the market often confuses this. The television gleams with hot picks and must-buy signals, but the principle remains, as quiet and steady as Elias with his lantern. True investing is not guessing. It is observing, learning, and only then deciding. In a nearby village, Years after Elias's story had faded into the dust of routine, there was a young woman named Leora. She had inherited a small parcel of land and was eager to make it productive. She consulted neighbors, spoke to vendors, and listened to a man in town who claimed that mushrooms, rare ones, would bring her the highest return. "They grow fast," he promised. "The price is high. The market is booming." But Elias, now in his twilight years, overheard her speaking once in the local store. He shuffled closer, gently. "Mushrooms grow fast," he said softly, "but they are also shy. They disappear with the wrong moon, the wrong moisture, or no reason at all." Leora looked confused. "So I shouldn't plant them?" Elias smiled and said nothing for a moment. "Then, plant them if you understand them, not because they glitter." He then handed her a page from his old notebook. It was a sketch of his own garden, a simple plot of onions, herbs, and one stubborn apple tree. "None of it made me rich," he said, "but I was never hungry." Leora planted both. Some mushrooms and herbs. One was speculation, one was investment. And slowly she learned to tell them apart. There is no villain in speculation. It is part of human nature, the same spark that launches invention and romance. But what Graham teaches in this first chapter is that speculation becomes dangerous when it masquerades as investment, when you mistake the thrill of movement for the safety of footing. Elias's lantern wasn't for the wind. It was for him. A reminder to see clearly, no matter how dark or golden the horizon seemed. And perhaps you too carry a kind of lantern, a set of principles you can hold gently but firmly, not to chase brightness, but to walk slowly through it. In the end, the lesson is simple. Like the rhythm of waves or the quiet turn of seasons, speculation asks, "What can I gain quickly?" Investment asks, "What is strong enough to last quietly?" And sometimes, that's all you need to sleep soundly. Chapter 2: The Investor and Inflation. The House of Shifting Walls. There once stood a modest house, built on a hill that overlooked a sleeping valley. It had thick stone walls, a red-tiled roof, and windows that always caught the morning light. The man who lived there was named Alden, quiet, cautious, and fond of stillness. He had spent his youth saving coin by coin, and when he was 40, he had built this house with his own hands and his own plans. It was not grand, but it was enough. Each room had a purpose. The study was for reading, the hearth for warmth, the larder for food. Alden measured his life not by additions, but by endurance. The walls had weathered storms, and the garden knew his footsteps like a heartbeat. Then, slowly, something began to change. Not in the house, but around it. The wind blew harder, the ground softened beneath the back wall. The prices in the market town rose inexplicably. A sack of flour that once cost 1 silver coin now cost 2. The mason who had once asked 5 coins for repairs now asked 10. Alden's woodpile, once ample for winter, vanished quicker in colder air. The house had not changed, but the world had. And the old walls no longer protected him as they once had. He took no Wi-Fi. He remained connected to the world through the walls in the kitchen. The house had not changed, but the world had, and the old walls no longer protected him as they once had. This, in soft metaphor, is the experience of inflation. Not a storm that breaks the roof, but a slow, quiet shifting of the world that renders once solid plans less solid, once safe shelters less safe. Benjamin Graham, in this second chapter, asks us not to panic over inflation, but to understand it, to see it not as an enemy, but as a climate, a natural rhythm of human economies, tied to time and change. Inflation is not a thief in the night. It is a rising tide. It doesn't take everything at once, but slowly erodes what once seemed permanent. A coin saved today may not buy the same bread tomorrow. A pension, once comforting, may find itself shrinking in its usefulness. Just as Alden's walls stood firm while the soil beneath them shifted, so too does money lose meaning if left unguarded. And yet there is no need for fear, only understanding. There's an old tale told in some parts of the East of a merchant who stored his wealth not in coins or gold, but in woven carpets, each one handcrafted by families in the highlands, thick, colorful, and woven with tales of myth and rain. He kept them rolled in a dry cellar, and each year when the price of grain changed or the currency dipped, he would trade a carpet, not for coins, but for what he needed: food, clothes, peace. "You store money," he once said to a visiting scholar, "but money dissolves. A carpet feeds me twice, once when it is made, once when it is traded." Inflation, you see, does not erode all value equally. It erodes what stands still, what is purely static. But value rooted in usefulness, in ownership, in production, that endures longer. This is why Graham invites us to consider how we store our efforts, not in the illusion of safety, but in the quiet armor of adaptability. Alden, noticing the changes in his world, did not despair. He did not curse the wind or the earth. Instead, he made small changes. He reinforced the back wall with deeper stone. He began to plant food in raised beds, higher from the softening ground. He traded excess herbs for stronger boots, and when his wood pile fell short, he made a new hearth that required less. His house remained modest, but it endured. The lesson in all of this, in Graham's soft-spoken logic, is not to avoid inflation, for we cannot, nor is it to chase endlessly after higher returns in panic, for that only invites risk disguised as opportunity. Rather, the lesson is to build with awareness, to know that what shelters us today may need tending tomorrow, that cash left idle will slowly lose its warmth, and that the things we build, real things, enduring things, are our best protection. A garden, a business, a book of skills, a relationship based on trust. These outlast, and perhaps, if you listen closely tonight, you'll hear the quiet wind brushing against your own house, asking not for fear, but for reflection. Do your walls still serve you? Are you storing your efforts in ways that stand firm, even when prices rise or winds shift? There's no rush to answer, only the gentle acknowledgement that change is always happening, and wisdom is the art of responding slowly with eyes open. As Alden sat near his hearth one evening, he sipped warm tea and ran a finger across the stone floor he had laid so many years ago. It was cracked now, but still solid, still warm beneath the firelight. And he smiled, not because everything was certain, but because he had learned to live in motion and still be still. And you, dear listener, may do the same. Now rest. Chapter 3. A Century of Stock Market History. The River and the Traveler. There is a river, wide and winding. that stretches across a land where the hills are gentle and the sky opens like a quiet prayer. It has no name on maps, for this river lives more in rhythm than in borders. Along its banks are stones worn smooth and trees that remember stories older than any man. It is said that anyone seeking to understand the markets must first understand this river. There was once a traveler who arrived at its banks, young, eager, carrying a satchel full of books and predictions. His name was Callum. He had studied graphs and models, read of booms and busts, and believed he could cross the river easily if he only understood its patterns. He sat for days, watching. He noticed the speed of the current in the morning, how it calmed by dusk. He saw that birds gathered before a rise in water. He marked the color of the river when the rains came upstream. Confident now, he chose a day to cross. When the waters were low, the skies clear, and the current seemed gentle. But halfway through, the river changed. Not violently, not maliciously, just naturally. A rainstorm, far upstream, long before he had arrived, sent water rushing hours later. Callum, startled, scrambled to the far shore, soaked and breathless. "I studied you," he muttered to the river. "I prepared." And the river, in its own way, replied, "But did you look back a century?" Benjamin Graham, in this third chapter, reminds us that to understand the market, truly understand it, we must look back further than the last few seasons. We must look not at days or years, but at decades. The stock market is like that river. It flows with both reason and mystery. There are rhythms to it, yes, but they stretch across eras, not afternoons. When Graham speaks of a century of stock market history, he is offering not prediction, but perspective. He is saying, "Come, sit by the river's edge. Watch not for patterns in the ripples, but in the tides." There was a farmer once, in the early 1900s, who invested in a railroad company, not because he read about it in a paper, not because it had gone up yesterday, but because he saw the line being laid. Still, across fields he had plowed as a child, he knew that trains would bring wheat eastward and coal westward. He knew the company owned land, and land stays. His investment rose, then fell, then rose again. Through 2 wars, through depression, through fear and celebration, but he held on, not because he was stubborn, but because he understood time. He planted seeds in spring, not for spring, but for autumn. Graham points to history not as an anchor, but as a map. In the early 1900s, the market saw panic. In the 1920s, euphoria. Then, in 1929, collapse. What followed was not a straight recovery, but a slow walk through smoke and uncertainty. The 1950s brought calm, the 60s growth, the 70s confusion, and still the market flowed. Like Callum's River, it did not promise ease, but it promised movement. And those who watched with patience, who studied its entire story, not just the peaks but the valleys, came to understand something deep. The market does not reward those who predict, but those who persist. Later in life, Callum returned to the river. He was older now, his hair touched with snow. He brought no charts this time, no books. He simply sat on a stone, watching a younger traveler attempting to measure the current with sticks and guesses. Callum smiled, remembering his own attempts, and then, quietly, he said to the young man, "This river, it does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. If you listen long enough, you'll hear the echoes. Graham's lesson, gently given, is this: there will be rises, there will be falls, but if you can zoom out, widen your lens, you may stop trying to time the ripples and start learning how to walk beside the water. The century of market history is not a warning, it is a lullaby. One that says, you are not the first to wonder, you will not be the last to learn, and the river will keep flowing. And now, with that river murmuring just beyond your window, you may allow your thoughts to soften. You do not need to cross tonight, you only need to rest. Chapter 4: General Portfolio Policy. The Defensive Investor. The two gardeners. In a village surrounded by hills and misty air, two gardens stood on opposite ends of the same cobbled street. They weren't large or famous, just quiet plots of earth that grew food, herbs, and sometimes, if the season was right, roses. One garden belonged to Miriam, a retired schoolteacher. Her garden was simple, well-tended, and unchanging. Rows of root vegetables, perennial herbs, a patch for cabbages and leeks. She watered on schedule, rotated the crops when needed, and pruned the vines with care. She knew her garden by heart. Not because it ever surprised her, but because it didn't need to. Across the lane, Thomas kept the other garden. A younger man, Thomas was brimming with curiosity. His plot was always changing. Some weeks it grew rare melons from the south. Others it was filled with exotic spices no one in the village had ever tasted. He built trellises, dug new trenches, ordered seeds from foreign catalogs. Sometimes it bloomed spectacularly. People gathered, drawn in by the color, the novelty, the mystery. And sometimes, well, the earth was quiet. When droughts came, Miriam's vegetables remained. They were deep-rooted and used to change. When the spring arrived late or the frost came early, her cabbages still curled up green and sturdy. Thomas's garden, for all its beauty, often struggled in those same times. One day, over tea, Thomas asked, "Why don't you try something new, Miriam? Something daring. You could get 10 times the harvest." Miriam smiled gently and replied, "Yes, but I only need one that lasts." This is, in soft metaphor, the soul of Benjamin Graham's 4th chapter, the portfolio policy for the defensive investor, not the timid investor, not the lazy investor, but the one who, like Miriam, values stability over excitement, resilience over novelty. Graham's definition of a defensive investor is someone not seeking to beat the market, but to keep pace with time, weather the seasons, and grow steadily. He recommends balance, a quiet 50/50 between stocks and bonds, a garden of vegetables and flowers, each serving a role. This isn't because he lacked imagination, quite the opposite. It's because he understood the emotional wear and tear of trying to chase the sun. You see, the market, like nature, is not always predictable. It rains when it shouldn't, it dries up when you need rain. The speculative garden may bloom once in glory, but it may also wither without warning. The defensive investor is not against risk. She simply doesn't invite it more than necessary. She knows her purpose, to preserve what she's grown, to harvest what she needs, and to sleep without worry in the months between. In another time, another place, a sailor once built a boat not for speed but for balance. Its sails were modest, its frame wide and slow, but when storms came, it stayed upright. While others capsized in their pursuit of faster winds, he floated steadily, reaching every shore in his own time. That sailor would have liked Miriam, and Graham, I think, would have liked them both. Now, what does this mean for you, lying quietly now, perhaps wondering how much of yourself is a Thomas and how much a Miriam? Maybe you've planted gardens of both, some seasons full of wonder, some full of worry. Graham reminds you, with the voice of a friend and the patience of an elder, that you don't need to choose forever. Only now, only this season. And if you're tired of the chase, of the noise, of the ever-moving tide of speculation and performance, you can return to the soil, the slow planting, the quiet kind of wealth. That's what the defensive investor does, not just with money, but with life. So tonight, as you lie in your own quiet garden, whether just sprouting or well-rooted, take a breath. Let it all settle. You don't have to grow everything. Just enough. Enough to carry you through the next season, and the one after that. And perhaps that's more than enough. Chapter 5. The Defensive Investor and Common Stocks. The Library of Lanterns. In a quiet city where the evenings stretched long and the air always smelled faintly of paper and ash, there was a library known only to those who needed it. It wasn't grand, no marble columns or domed ceilings, but it was old, older than most of the buildings around it. Its windows were small and clouded, its steps creaked like old wooden ships, but those who entered found something rare inside. Instead of candles or electric lights, the library was lit by lanterns. Each book, when pulled from its shelf, caused a nearby lantern to flicker to life, not with fire, but with a soft blue glow. The deeper the wisdom in the book, the warmer the light, and the librarian, a woman named Eleanor, walked the halls not with a cart or keys, but with memory. People came from all parts of the city to ask her the same question, though they asked it in many ways. What book will make me wise? Which one will make me rich? Which one will help me win? Eleanor would always pause, then lead them not to the shelves lined with gilded titles or flashy covers, but to a quieter section, filled with thick, unassuming volumes with names like Dividends, A Century, Earnings Records of Industrials, and Balance Sheets Through War. The visitors would frown. Not exciting, one might say. No, she'd reply. Just steady. This, in its own way, is the spirit of Benjamin Graham's 5th chapter. The defensive investor, he explains, is not just someone who diversifies or balances. She is someone who chooses her stocks, her ownership in businesses with the same calm discernment as one chooses a book worth rereading every year. Graham doesn't say you must avoid stocks. He simply urges you to select them carefully. Not the loud, not the new, not the ones shouting promises from glowing screens, but the ones that have weathered years, the ones with lanterns. Inside. There was once a man who built clocks, not for sale, but for silence. He carved each gear by hand, polished each bell with beeswax, and tested them in his own cottage before giving them away to those who needed time. He used only wood from older trees, not because he distrusted the new, but because the old had proven itself. Through drought, through winter, through lightning, his clocks never ran the fastest, but they never stopped, without reason. That is what Graham suggests with common stocks for the defensive investor. Choose companies that pay dividends regularly, that have strong records of earnings, that don't chase trends, that don't vanish when the tide pulls out. Choose clocks that keep time. You might be lying there now, thinking of all the names you've heard in markets, the flashy startups, the sudden winners, the miracle stories of someone buying at $3 and selling at $300. But Eleanor Graham offers something quieter. They offer companies that make soap, that sell groceries, that power homes, that manufacture rail ties and packing tape. Unromantic? Perhaps. But these are the companies that stay. Their prices will rise and fall, yes. But over the years, they will pay you, not always with excitement, but with reliability. One evening, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the library floor, a young man returned to Eleanor. He had taken her books months ago, the ones with the plain covers and patient advice. "I didn't get rich," he said. Eleanor smiled. "Not yet." "But," he added, "I slept better. I stopped checking prices every hour. I started noticing the seasons again." "Then," she said, handing him another lantern, "you've begun to understand. You see, Graham isn't asking you to give up growth. He's asking you to ground it. He's reminding you that common stocks, real ownership in real businesses, can be part of your quiet garden, as long as you choose carefully. Look for size, look for strength, look for a history of steady, unspectacular service. Look not for noise, but for the quiet hum of things that work, like clocks, like libraries, like good sleep. And now, with that same calm light resting gently over your own thoughts, you can begin to let go of the noise. There's no decision to make tonight, no ticker to check, just shelves of steady stories and a lantern still glowing near your bed. Sleep well. Chapter 6. Portfolio Policy for the Enterprising Investor. Negative Approach. The Lighthouse in the Storm. In a coastal town where the sky often hung heavy with salt and clouds, there stood a lighthouse, built not for glory, but for survival. It wasn't grand or painted for tourists, just tall, gray, and steadfast. Its base was thick stone, the lantern room lined with copper to resist the endless sea spray. The townspeople rarely spoke of it, except when the weather turned. And yet, it had saved countless lives without ever moving an inch. The man who maintained it was called Rurik. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his voice had the kind of weight that comes from watching storms up close. Rurik had seen young sailors come and go, some cautious, some brimming with confidence. Often they would sail out in clear weather, eager to cut corners, chasing speed over direction. He never stopped them. He only reminded them where the rocks were. Most didn't listen. Not because they were reckless, but because they mistook calm waters for safe ones. They confused a smooth beginning with a guaranteed end. This is the kind of quiet warning Benjamin Graham offers in Chapter 6, while the previous chapters offer a peaceful portrait of the defensive investor, someone content to walk carefully, slowly. This chapter acknowledges another kind of traveler, the enterprising investor, the one willing to dig deeper, spend more time, and perhaps take on more risk in the hope of better returns. But Graham does not begin with encouragement. He begins with caution. Before offering maps or ideas, he outlines the territory that must be avoided. He lights the rocks. Too often, people drawn to active investing fall not because of the journey itself, but because of the roads they should never have taken. High-yield junk bonds, hot new issues, trendy sectors with no earnings and even less stability. Graham calls these out not in anger, but in care. Like Rurik, he's not trying to stop your voyage, he's simply trying to show you the places where even strong ships sink. In the town by the sea, there was once a boy who asked Rurik why he spent so much time repairing the lower stones of the lighthouse. "No one sees them," the boy said. "Why not paint the top instead?" Rurik, without looking up, replied, "Because it's not the part you see that keeps the light standing." Likewise, in investing, it is not the exciting part that protects you. It's the foundation, the quiet decisions made far below the surface. Not overpaying, not reaching for yield, not buying what you don't understand. These are not thrilling principles, but they are the ones that hold up the lantern when the market goes dark. There was once a man, clever, well-read, optimistic, who believed he had found a new strategy. He ignored Graham's warnings. He invested in fast-moving, high-risk securities that promised big returns. For a while, it worked. His name was spoken at dinners, quoted in newsletters, admired by those looking for shortcuts. But like a sailor who laughs at the lighthouse and turns too close to shore, his luck changed quickly. A downturn came. The companies he trusted folded like paper. He lost more than money. He lost time, peace, and trust in the process. In the end, he returned, not to new strategies, but to older wisdom. The lesson is not that risk must be avoided at all costs, but that certain kinds of risk wear disguises. They appear exciting, urgent, full of promise. But underneath they are hollow. Graham teaches that the enterprising investor must not only study opportunities, but first and above all else, study what to avoid. The image of the lighthouse is a fitting one, because its job is not to control the sea. It cannot prevent storms. It does not move with the tides or try to chart every wave. It simply stands, unglamorous, often ignored, marking the edge between safety and danger, and that is what Graham offers here, a steady presence in a world that invites haste. As you listen now, perhaps lying in your own safe harbor, with the day's waves having calmed and the night stretching like a soft blanket across the sky, there's no need to chase anything. Let the noisy trades pass. Let the shining promises float by. Know that you are not behind, and you are not missing out. The rocks are not your enemy, but your reminder. A good sailor studies storms not to fear them, but to respect them. And the good investor does the same. Sleep now. The light is still on. Chapter 7. Portfolio Policy for the Enterprising Investor. The Positive Side. The Stone Collector of Kerith Vale. In the shaded valley of Kerith, far from the markets and machines of the larger world, there lived an old man known simply as Ephron. He was a stone collector. Not a miner, not a jeweler, just a quiet man who, for decades, walked the streams and cliffs of the valley, gently lifting stones from the riverbed or prying them loose from old forest paths. He didn't sell them. He didn't display them. He simply cleaned them, studied them, and placed each one on a shelf in a long wooden shed behind his cottage. To outsiders, it seemed like a hobby, perhaps even a harmless eccentricity, but the people of Carth knew better. Ephron's collection was a history, a kind of wisdom. Because every so often, once every few years, sometimes a decade, someone would come to him seeking a particular kind of stone. Not flashy, not polished, but rare, useful, specific. And Ephron, without hesitation, would walk to the shed, select a quiet overlooked piece, and hand it over. And every time, without fail, it was exactly what was needed. Ephron, you see, didn't wait for the world to tell him what was valuable. He looked for value long before the world noticed. He studied, he walked, he took his time, and he only chose stones with care, leaving hundreds untouched, not because they weren't pretty, but because they weren't right. This story, quietly unfolding in a forgotten valley, mirrors the essence of what Benjamin Graham describes in Chapter 7, the positive side of being an enterprising investor. Having warned of the dangers, the speculation traps, and the deceptive glamour in previous chapters, Graham now offers a path forward for those who wish to do more. Not chase, but dig. Not predict, but uncover. The enterprising investor is, in this sense, a kind of modern-day Ephron. Not chasing the glittering stones everyone talks about, but studying patiently, looking not just at what something appears to be, but at what it is, its earnings, its balance sheet, its place in the world, and most importantly, its price in relation to its value. Graham calls this approach value investing, but that phrase, when spoken slowly, is more than a technique, it's a temperament. There was a woman in the nearby town who made furniture. Not quickly, not cheaply. Her chairs didn't shine under showroom lights, but they held people for generations. She once said, "I don't make for today, I make for the memory." That too is what the enterprising investor does. They invest not in trends, but in endurance, not in stories, but in substance. Graham reminds us that to succeed in this quieter form of investing requires effort, careful reading of company reports, comparison of figures, understanding industry trends, not through headlines but through slow reflection. But he also says something gentler, more human, that the work itself is where much of the reward lies. To study without haste, to act without noise, to think slowly in a world that pushes speed. In time, many came to Ephron's shed, not because he advertised, not because his stones shone, but because he had spent years quietly preparing for what others were just beginning to need. His shelves were not cluttered but curated. He had passed over thousands of stones, and so the few he kept mattered. This chapter is not a call to action. It is a quiet invitation. Graham is not urging everyone to become an enterprising investor. In fact, he's careful to say that many would be better off remaining defensive, sleeping soundly with a balanced, low-maintenance portfolio. But for those who are inclined, who feel a pull toward understanding businesses more deeply and are willing to spend the time, this path offers its own kind of peace, a peace not of shortcuts or certainty, but of clarity earned slowly. As the evening settles and your thoughts soften like the distant hush of river stones being gently rolled by current, perhaps you can imagine yourself in Ephron's shed, holding a stone not for its shine, but for its shape, its history, its quiet purpose. And perhaps with that in mind, you can rest, knowing that in this life, some things are still built with care, some things still reward patience, and some things, like old stones and old wisdom, are meant to be held slowly. Sleep well. Chapter 8. The Investor and Market Fluctuations. The House with the Talking Windows. On the edge of a city that never fully slept, where the traffic hushed at dawn but never disappeared, there was a small house with windows that could speak. Not with words exactly, but with sounds. The panes creaked when the weather shifted, moaned gently during storms, and gave off the faintest whistle when the wind came from the west. The house was old, and the windows had seen many seasons. The owners over the years learned not to fear the noise, but to listen to it, like a tide that tells you when it's coming in and when it's pulling away. The latest owner of the house was a man named Jonah. He was not a builder or an investor or a person of great ambitions. He had simply inherited the house from an aunt who had passed peacefully in her sleep. When Jonah moved in, the first thing he noticed was the noise. The windows spoke constantly. They expanded with the morning sun, shuddered at dusk, and sometimes, in the quiet of night, they whispered soft warnings that no one else could hear. At first, Jonah tried to fix them. He sealed cracks, adjusted hinges, even considered replacing them altogether. But no matter what he did, they kept talking. Then, one evening after a long day filled with small frustrations, Jonah sat near the front window and simply listened. And what he heard, or rather what he understood, was that the windows were not broken. They were breathing, responding, reacting to things beyond the walls. This story, with its slow unfolding and barely perceptible lessons, reflects the heart of Benjamin Graham's 8th chapter, the one that speaks of market fluctuations and the investor's relationship to them. Graham does not tell you to predict the market. He does not ask you to outsmart it. Instead, he asks you to listen to it as you would a shifting house, to accept that movement is natural and that panic is optional. Graham introduces a simple but powerful metaphor here. Mr. Market, a fictional business partner who shows up at your door every day offering to buy your interest or sell you his, sometimes at wild prices, sometimes at fair ones. Some days he's euphoric and offers you far more than your business is worth. Other days he's deeply pessimistic and offers you a pittance. But Graham's quiet brilliance lies in what he doesn't ask. He doesn't ask you to change Mr. Market. He simply asks you not to let Mr. Market change you. In the city where Jonah lived, there was a bakery across the street from his house. The baker, a kind-eyed woman named Rosa, opened each day at 6 and closed when the bread was gone. One morning, a man came in and asked if she thought bread would be more expensive next week. She laughed gently and said, "I don't sell next week's bread. I make today's." That in its essence is the message to investors. Don't let the imagined future, the noise of next week's price, drown out the calm of today's value. The market will fluctuate. It always has. It always will. Your job is not to surf every wave, but to build something that floats even when the current is strange. Jonah eventually stopped trying to silence the windows. He learned to welcome their creaks as reminders that the world outside was always shifting, but that his foundation could remain strong. He read quietly by the light that streamed through them. He slept with their moans in the background, no longer as warnings but as lullabies. And in the world of investing, the lesson is the same. Prices will rise and fall, opinions will swirl like leaves in a wind tunnel, but if you have done your thinking carefully, if you know why you own what you own, if you have not paid more than something is worth, then the fluctuations are not a threat. They are background music. They are talking windows. They are talking windows. They are talking Mr. Market. knocking on your door, waiting to see if you'll dance to his mood or wait until the timing is right for you. The calmest investors are not the ones who predict the future. They are the ones who have stopped needing to. So tonight, perhaps you find yourself near your own kind of window, real or metaphorical. Perhaps thoughts drift in about the market, the future, the things that go up and down without your permission. But know this: you are allowed to let them pass, to observe without reacting, to let the noise come and go. Because the house is still standing, the foundation is still yours, and Mr. Market will be back tomorrow just as confused as ever. Let him knock. You don't have to answer tonight. Just rest. Let's now drift quietly into Chapter 9, a chapter that speaks to trust, patience, and the delicate balance of letting someone else tend your garden. Chapter 9, Investing in Investment Funds. The Orchard You Didn't Plant. There was once a town nestled between two hills, where the air smelled of pine in the mornings and of old firewood at night. In this town, orchards lined the outskirts. Some were wild, the trees leaning in directions that made no sense, fruit falling in abundance one year and barely at all the next. But a few orchards, neatly fenced, carefully pruned, were run by professionals, gardeners who promised that if you paid them a portion of your harvest, they would tend the trees for you, water the soil, and deliver fruit without you needing to lift a hand. In this village lived an old woman named Nessa. She had inherited a small orchard from her brother, 3 rows of apple trees, still young, still uncertain, but she was no gardener. Her hands knew paper and pen, not bark and shears, so she did what many would do. She visited the nearest managed orchard, where a man with a kind face and polished boots promised steady returns and better yields than any other plot in town. For a few seasons she was pleased. Baskets arrived on time, apples were red, firm, fragrant, but one year the harvest was late, the next smaller, and then nothing at all. When she returned to ask what had happened, the gardener showed her a list of reasons: weather, market changes, experiments that hadn't worked out. But, he assured her, we're still charging our usual care fee. The systems are in place. Trust the process. Nessa walked away quietly, her basket empty. This, softly told, is the shape of Graham's 9th chapter, a meditation on investment funds, mutual funds, and the careful decision to let others manage your money. It is not a condemnation, but a caution, a whisper rather than a warning. Graham acknowledges that most investors cannot or should not manage every detail themselves. Time, experience, and even temperament often make it reasonable to entrust one's capital to professionals, but he urges us not to do so blindly. He reminds us that many funds underperform, not because they are evil or foolish, but because they are busy trying to beat the market, chase trends, outshine their competitors. In the process, their fees accumulate steadily, regardless of how much fruit they actually deliver. It is possible, Graham says, for a fund to earn little for you and much for itself. There is a carpenter in a nearby village who makes chairs from reclaimed wood. He once told a friend, "If I'm going to sit in something for the rest of my life, I want to know how it was built." That's the core of this chapter. You don't have to build the orchard yourself, but you must understand who is tending it. What are their values? Are they pruning for beauty or for stability? Are they honest in good years and in bad? Not all managed funds are problematic. Some are low cost, disciplined and long-term in philosophy. Some don't promise the moon, they promise the seasons, the slow return of steady growth. And these, Graham says, are worth considering, but only after careful thought, not because a fund was on a list, not because a neighbor said so, not because last year it returned 24%. Because you've looked, listened, read the prospectus like a gardener studies the soil, because you understand the orchard even if you don't work it. Nessa, in the end, didn't abandon her apples. She learned to walk among them, slowly, hiring a quiet man from the outskirts who charged little and talked even less. "He doesn't promise much," she once told a neighbor, "just that he'll be there tomorrow." And in time, the apples came back, not in a flood, not in glory, but enough. Enough to fill her basket and share with those who remembered when she had none. There is no shame in seeking help with your investments. There is wisdom in it. But wisdom also asks that you understand the hands you've placed your future in, that you know the cost, not just in coins, but in confidence, that you listen not to the headlines, but to the hum beneath the surface. Because not all orchards yield equally, and not all caretakers are tending your fruit. So tonight, as you lie back, perhaps you think of your own orchard, real or metaphorical, whether it's tended by you or by another, whether it yields much or little, whether it rests under a good steward's hands. You don't need to know all the answers tonight, but you can begin to ask the right questions, and then you can sleep. The trees will keep growing while you do. Chapter 10. The Investor and His Advisors. The Boat Builder and the Mapmaker. In a quiet harbor town carved into the side of cliffs where the tide hummed softly against the rocks and the gulls flew low in the morning fog, there lived a man named Corin. Corin was a boat builder. Not a sailor, not a fisherman, not a merchant, but a man who shaped the vessels that carried others across oceans and rivers. His workshop was filled with cedar dust and the scent of pine resin. Rows of tools hung from the beams, each worn smooth from decades of use. His hands were weathered but steady. He built slowly and always by feel. One day, a young merchant came to him with a request. "I need a boat," the merchant said, "to take me across the narrow sea. But I also want it fast and wide and easy to turn, and able to carry great weight, and small enough to avoid attention." Corin looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard every kind of contradiction. Then he nodded, slowly, and said, "Come back in a week." During that week, Corin did not cut wood. He did not shape hulls. Instead, he walked up the cliffs to the home of a woman named Lena, the town's mapmaker. Lena was quiet, methodical. Her home smelled of ink and old rain. She had spent her life drawing the coasts, not from guesswork, but from hours sitting on cliff ledges, watching tides and measuring stars. Her maps were not colorful or decorative, but they were true. Corin told her of the merchant's journey. Lena listened, then rolled out a chart. She pointed to where the currents curled, where the rocks waded just beneath the surface, where the fog was thickest. She did not offer opinions. She offered only what was there, what had been observed. When the merchant returned, Corin handed him a small boat, not large, not fancy, but sturdy. And he gave him Lena's map. "This boat," Corin said, "is not perfect, but it matches this map. And this map does not lie." The merchant frowned. "But is it enough?" Corin shrugged. "It depends whom you trust more, the ocean or your advisor. This story, though shaped like a fable, is the essence of Chapter 10 in The Intelligent Investor. Graham steps aside from charts and ratios and instead talks about advice, specifically who gives it, why they give it, and whether or not it's truly meant for you. In the world of investing, many are drawn to experts, to brokers, financial planners, consultants, newsletters, television hosts. It is a natural instinct. When faced with uncertainty, we reach for someone who seems certain, but Graham gently reminds us that not all advice is equal, and more importantly, not all advice is given for your benefit. Some advisors are like Lena, patient, honest, rooted in observation. They do not promise gains. They provide understanding. Others are like map sellers who've never left their shops, loud with their confidence, quiet with their records. They offer you bright charts but no history. And some, Graham notes, are simply vendors, paid not to guide but to sell. The true value of an advisor is not in their vocabulary or their title or even their performance last year. It lies in their alignment with your needs, your goals, your temperament. The enterprising investor might choose to navigate alone, relying on his own compass and books. But the defensive investor, and many of us are just that, may seek guidance. If so, Graham suggests, do it with care. He offers a simple test, though he never calls it that. Is the advisor selling you a product or helping you build a path? Are they speaking of your life or just your portfolio? Do they benefit more when you act often or when you do nothing at all? In the harbor town, many later asked Corin why he trusted Lena so much. He said, "Because she doesn't sell me the sea, she only shows me where the rocks are." That kind of guidance is rare and valuable. You may, as you lie still now, be thinking of your own advisors, financial or otherwise, the ones whose voices echo in your mind when you're uncertain. Friends, professionals, mentors. Some well-meaning, some persuasive, some quietly wise. And perhaps tonight you need not choose whose voice to follow. Perhaps it's enough to ask, do they understand your map? Have they walked the coast? Do they gain when you sail fast or when you sail safe? There is peace in finding someone who sees clearly, not because they know what will happen, but because they are honest about what might. And so you can rest. Not because you know every answer, but because you've started asking better questions. The tide will be there tomorrow, but for now the harbor is calm. Let us now drift softly into Chapter 11, where Graham returns to a fundamental question many investors avoid, one that rests not in the market, but in ourselves. Chapter 11, Security Analysis for the Lay Investor, General Approach. The mirror beneath the ledger. In a small town, whose streets were lined with sycamore trees and window boxes that spilled over with thyme and lavender, there was a curious little shop tucked between the bakery and the post office. It didn't sell anything, its windows held no signs, and the door bore no name. But people went there, often in moments of decision, confusion, or quiet restlessness. Inside, there was no clerk, just a large mirror mounted above an old wooden desk and a thick ledger bound in brown leather resting beneath it. Visitors would enter, sit at the desk, and open the ledger. Page after page they would find questions. Not about dreams or goals, but about numbers, about what something cost, about how often it had changed, about where the money had gone. Some would glance up at the mirror before answering. Others stared at their reflections for minutes before writing anything at all. And when they left, they took nothing with them. No printouts, no pamphlets, just clarity. This small room, with its unadorned mirror and quiet ledger, is a metaphor for what Benjamin Graham introduces in Chapter 11, Security Analysis. The words may sound complex, even intimidating, but Graham's tone here is not one of gatekeeping. Instead, it is gentle encouragement, a whisper that says, you don't need to be a professional to ask the right question. Security analysis at its heart is not a science of perfection. It is the practice of looking beneath the surface of an investment, especially a stock, and asking, what is this business? What does it earn? What does it spend? Is it stable? Has it grown? How much am I paying for this? And why? Graham doesn't suggest that every investor become an analyst. He knows that most don't have the time or tools to comb through balance sheets by candlelight. But he does believe, and quietly insists, that you understand at least the basics of what you're buying. Not just the name or the price or the buzz, but the substance. He introduces principles that are beautifully simple: earnings records over time, stability of dividends, reasonable price relative to value. These are not hidden in vaults or coded in formulas. They're usually printed right there in annual reports, in filings, in the numbers the company itself provides. But Graham knows something deeper. Most people don't skip this analysis because they're lazy. They skip it because they're afraid. Afraid of not understanding. Afraid of what they might see. Afraid, perhaps, that the thing they hoped was magical is actually just average. That's why the mirror matters. There's a story told in the town of a man who came to the little shop every Friday afternoon. He never wrote in the ledger, never said a word, just sat and stared at the mirror, sometimes for hours. People thought him odd, until one day, after a particularly bad storm had damaged half the town's storefronts, he was seen helping every business rebuild, not with advice, but with money. Quietly, consistently, with no explanation, and when asked how he had saved so much, he said, "I only bought what I understood. The rest I left in the ledger." This chapter, with all its technical name and structural tone, is not about complexity, it is about grounding, about facing the numbers with patience and humility, about knowing enough to make peace with your choices, about reading not just the lines on the page, but what they reflect in you. Because every investment you hold is a mirror. It shows your tolerance, your trust, your reasoning. And if the reflection makes you anxious, or if the numbers feel like fog, then perhaps the investment wasn't chosen, it was followed. So tonight, as you lie there letting your thoughts soften and slow, imagine yourself at that desk, the ledger open, the mirror still, no one watching, no pressure to act, just questions, gentle ones. Like, do I understand what I own? Do the numbers tell a story? Would I still hold this if no one else talked about it? Let the answers come slowly, or not at all tonight. Because analysis, at its best, is not about quick decisions. It is about peaceful understanding. And with that understanding, faint, forming, or complete, you may rest. The mirror doesn't judge, the ledger does not rush, and neither should you. Chapter 12. Things to consider about per-share earnings. The growing tree in the courtyard. In the middle of a quiet monastery high in the hills, there grew a single tree. It stood alone in the courtyard, not the tallest nor the most fragrant, but old and watchful. The monks called it the ledger tree, not because of what it was, but because of how it was kept. Every year, on the same day, a monk would walk into the courtyard, sit cross-legged beside the tree, and make a simple mark in a little black book. The number of new branches, the direction of growth, and whether the roots had lifted any new stones. For over 100 years, this record had been kept. The tree's growth was steady, modest. Some years gave more shade, some less. But the monks never altered their observations. They didn't estimate or project. They just recorded what was. And one day, a traveler arrived. He had come from the city below, where people spoke in sharp numbers and loud expectations. He admired the tree and asked, "How much will it grow next year?" The monk answered softly, "We'll see." "But what's your estimate?" the traveler insisted. The monk looked down at his notes. "I don't estimate. I observe." The traveler frowned. "But without predictions, how do you value it? How do you plan?" And with a smile that only time can teach, the monk said, "Not all growth is forward. Some of it is downward. Some of it holds still. That's how the tree survives the storms." This quiet exchange captures the essence of Graham's reflections in Chapter 12, a chapter about earnings per share and the illusions we often build around them. For many investors, the per-share earnings figure is like a lighthouse in the fog, a single number meant to guide decisions. And yet, Graham warns us, these numbers are not always what they seem. You see, earnings, particularly on a per-share basis, are like footprints in soft soil. They may show where a company has walked, but they don't always tell you how it got there or what it had to carry to take each step. Companies can report growing earnings while weakening elsewhere, borrowing too much, cutting corners, or relying on temporary boosts that won't last. And just as importantly, companies can report steady or declining earnings even while strengthening their core, investing in research, caring for employees, weathering hard years with patience. Graham doesn't say we should ignore earnings, far from it, but he wants us to contextualize them, to understand how they were created, to be wary of projections that look too straight, too smooth, too perfect, because businesses, like trees, do not grow in perfect lines. They adapt, they thicken, they pause, sometimes they even prune themselves, choosing smaller earnings today in order to survive tomorrow. There's a story of a merchant in a mountain village who always left one shelf in his store empty. When asked why, he said, "So I can see what I don't have." That too is a form of understanding, knowing what's not in the number, what's not being said, and in the world of per-share earnings, what's not said can be just as important as what is. Back in the monastery, the monks never cut the ledger tree to make it grow faster. They never added false branches or glued on blossoms for visitors. They simply cared for the roots, checked the soil, gave it time, and in doing so, the tree outlasted them all. So tonight, if you find yourself wondering about growth, in your portfolio, in your life, in anything you measure, perhaps it's worth remembering that not all progress shows up in numbers, and not all numbers tell the truth. Let your mind rest where the monks did, not in prediction, but in observation, in care, in patience. Let the figures breathe. Let the branches stretch or still as they please. Growth is not a straight road. It is a courtyard tree, breathing with the seasons. And you don't need to know how tall it will be tomorrow to sit peacefully beneath it tonight. Let us now drift gently into chapter 13, where Graham asks us to consider the stories behind numbers, the dangers of popularity, and the subtle differences between what's bright and what's true. Chapter 13, a comparison of 4 listed companies. Village of 4 lamps. Once, nestled in a low valley that caught the morning fog like a blanket, there stood a village with 4 central lampposts. These lamps weren't ordinary. They were part of the town's rhythm. Each one had been donated by a different family many generations ago, and each cast a different kind of light. The first lamp was tall and sleek, wrapped in polished silver. Its light was bright and piercing, almost too bright, drawing moths in circles each night. People gathered near it, speaking of opportunity, growth, and possibility. This, they said, is the lamp that lights the future. The second was older, wrought iron with gentle scrollwork. Its light was steady and soft, illuminating just enough to see your steps, but never blinding. The elders loved this one. It doesn't promise much, they'd say, but it never flickers. The third lamp had strange wiring and flickered wildly. One day it would burn 3 times as bright as the others. The next day it would sputter and go dark for hours. Children loved it. Some shopkeepers did too. Its bursts of brilliance brought crowds. Unpredictable, they'd say, but exciting. And the fourth lamp? It was quiet, dull even. Its light leaned slightly yellow and covered a small patch of road. No one gathered near it. Few even spoke of it. But each morning when the fog cleared, its bulb was still warm. It had never once gone out. One year, a group of visiting engineers came to study the lamps. They tested current, efficiency, cost, stability. And when they shared their report with the villagers, the findings were surprising. The brightest lamp, it consumed the most energy and needed frequent repair. Its glow was beautiful but costly. The flickering one, it sometimes tripled output, but failed more often than any other. The old iron lamp, reliable but nearing its end unless carefully maintained. And the forgotten yellow one, modest, yes, but consistent, affordable, and quietly resilient. This story, shaped like folklore, holds within it the wisdom of chapter 13, in which Benjamin Graham compares 4 real companies, side by side, not through narrative or noise, but through quiet, patient analysis. In doing so, he teaches us something profoundly simple. Popularity does not equal longevity, and price does not equal longevity. And price, above all, is only meaningful in relation to substance. He takes these companies, each with a reputation, a story, a following, and looks beneath the surface. He studies earnings, debt, dividends, consistency, and like the engineers in the village, he discovers what many investors miss, that the most talked about company may not be the most trustworthy, and that the quiet ones may carry the deepest strength. Graham is not interested in excitement. He is interested in clarity. When comparing investments, he urges us to ask calm, basic questions. How long has this company been profitable? What is its return on equity? How much debt does it carry? What is its price relative to what it earns? These are not thrilling questions, but they are grounding ones. There's an old saying in the village, when fog covers the road, don't follow the glow, follow the stones. In investing, the glow is the hype, the headlines, the stories people tell at parties. The stones are the numbers, the fundamentals, the parts that remain when the fog lifts. In time, villagers began to walk a little differently through the square. Some still gathered at the bright lamp, others found charm in the flickering one, but many began to pause quietly near the dull yellow light, understanding at last that safety and clarity often live in the places we overlook. So as you close your eyes now and let the day's brightness begin to dim, perhaps think not of the flash, but of the steady, not of the brightest lamp, but the one that never fails. Because in life, as in investing, the most reliable light is the one that still shines when no one's watching. Let us now step quietly into chapter 14, a chapter where Graham extends his hand to the defensive investor and shows how simplicity, when chosen wisely, can be more powerful than cleverness. Chapter 14, Stock Selection for the Defensive Investor. The Basket and the River. Along a gentle river that curved like a question mark through open fields, there lived a weaver named Eli. His hands were known not for their speed, but for their rhythm, slow, certain, and steady. Eli made baskets, not the kind sold in markets filled with color and decoration, but plain ones, tightly bound, sturdy enough to carry grain, fruit, even stones. He believed that a good basket should last long enough that you forget when you bought it. Now across the river lived a merchant named Laron. Laron was quick-witted, fast-talking, and always searching for the next big thing. He too used baskets, but rarely the same one twice. This one's woven from silk threads, he'd say. This one's fireproof. This one repels water and flies. People marveled at his baskets, but they frayed, cracked, broke under weight. One season, the river swelled after heavy rains. Fields flooded, goods were lost, and in the end, only a few baskets remained, those that had been made not with style, but with sense. Graham, in this chapter, speaks to the Eli in each of us, the part that wants to build something strong, something that lasts, something that doesn't need constant watching. The defensive investor, he calls this person, not fearful, but cautious, not chasing brilliance, but anchoring in principles. He lays out, gently, the traits a stock should have if it is to be part of such a long-lasting basket. First, size. Large, established companies with proven histories. Second, strong financial condition, moderate debt, healthy current ratios. Third, stable earnings, not flashy but dependable. 10 years of profits without gaps. Fourth, consistent dividends, not necessarily high but regular. Fifth, moderate growth, steady improvement over a decade. And sixth, reasonable valuation, not overpaying, even for quality. Each of these criteria is like a strand in Eli's basket. Alone, perhaps ordinary, but together they create something reliable, a weave of prudence, not promise. This isn't an approach that turns heads. It doesn't promise quick returns or brag-worthy trades, but it works. Because it doesn't rely on guessing, it relies on enduring patterns, on past behavior that whispers what a business may do next, not perfectly, but probably. There's a soft strength in this method. It doesn't demand prediction. It doesn't hinge on tomorrow's news. It simply asks that you choose carefully and then step back. In time, Laurent came to Eli, not in pride, but in humility. His goods had been lost again, his baskets too fragile. "I need something that lasts," he said. Eli didn't mock him. He handed him a plain basket and said, "It's not magic, it's just patient." That's what Graham tells us in chapter 14. You don't need to be brilliant. You don't need to forecast the future. You only need to build your investment basket from things that have proven they can bear the weight of time. So tonight, as your thoughts soften and drift, picture yourself by the river, not rushing across, not leaping from stone to stone, but walking calmly with a basket in hand, not flashy, not new, but strong, woven with care, and filled not with promises, but with peace. Because the best investments don't demand your attention every day. They simply do their job, quietly. Let's now turn softly to chapter 15, a place where the cautious steps of the defensive investor give way to the more deliberate stride of the enterprising one. Here, Graham doesn't rush us forward. He merely opens a new path and asks, "Are you ready to walk it with awareness?" Chapter 15, Stock Selection for the Enterprising Investor. The Lantern Keeper's Watch. On the edge of a great forest, where the trails forked like old rivers, and the trees whispered old secrets in the wind, there lived a lantern keeper named Mara. She was not a guide nor a map maker. She didn't tell people where to go. Instead, she kept watch over the paths each night, lighting her lantern, walking the route slowly, noting the changes, which branches had fallen, which stones had shifted, which animals had wandered near. Travelers would often come to her with questions. Which path is best? Which one leads to treasure? Which trail will be easiest? Mara never answered quickly. She would ask questions in return. How much are you carrying? How far do you plan to go? Can you read the signs in the trees? She understood something many didn't, that no path was inherently better. But some paths required more of you, more attention, more patience, more care. This story is a quiet companion to chapter 15, where Graham introduces a different kind of investor, the enterprising one. This is someone who is willing to put in the effort, the time, the diligence, not to gamble, not to chase, but to watch closely, like Mara. The enterprising investor, Graham tells us, must be selective, not in a way that seeks glamour or excitement, but in a way that seeks discrepancy. That is, situations where a company's market price differs meaningfully from its intrinsic value. And to find such opportunities, you must look where others don't. Beyond the headlines, beneath the surface, he offers several places to search: undervalued stocks, bargain issues, neglected companies, special situations. These are not bright lit signs along the road. They're more like moss on the north side of a tree. Subtle, often overlooked, and only meaningful if you know how to read them. And Graham is careful, always careful, to remind us this path is not for everyone. The work is slow, the results may take time, the risks are higher if rushed, but for those willing to walk it with eyes open, the rewards are not just financial. They are clarifying. The act of selection becomes a discipline, a way to know the world and yourself. Think of a man named Ivo, a craftsman in a distant city who built clocks. He never sold many because he refused to make them in haste. Each gear was polished by hand, each weight calibrated by feel. And when someone once asked why he didn't scale up, why he didn't hire a team and expand his profits, Ivo smiled and said, "Because then I'd have to stop watching the time. And I like watching the time." That's the enterprising investor. Not rushing, not distracted, not buying because something is hot, but watching, thinking, moving when others pause, and pausing when others rush. Back in the forest, Mara never promised safety, but those who walked with her lantern said the journey felt different. Not easier, just clearer. And when they reached their destination, sometimes days, sometimes weeks later, they often returned. Not because the treasure was great, but because the walk had taught them something about themselves. Graham in this chapter isn't urging you to become enterprising. He's simply showing you what it means. That it's not glamour, it's not genius. It's quiet, patient study, thoughtful movement, and the willingness to look where others don't, not because you're smarter, but because you're still. So tonight, if you're the kind of person who watches patterns, who notices when something is just slightly off or slightly undervalued, perhaps the enterprising path calls to you. Not loudly, just with the soft glow of a lantern. And whether you walk it or not, know this: value does not always shine. Sometimes it waits quietly, under fallen leaves and unspoken stories. And sometimes all it needs is a calm pair of eyes to find it. Let us now ease into chapter 16, where Graham gently removes the mask from one of the most misunderstood tools in investing, the price-earnings ratio. But instead of warning or preaching, he invites us to simply observe, to look a little longer and see what might have been missed. Chapter 16, Convertible Issues and Warrants. The Shop of Shifting Labels. In an old town where the streets wound like threads in a tapestry, there stood a peculiar little shop, tucked between a spice merchant and a cobbler. Its wooden sign had no name, only the image of a key slowly turning in a lock. Inside, the shelves were filled not with objects, but with labels. Thick paper tags, some bright, some faded, each bearing a number and a promise. These weren't ordinary price tags. They were potential prices. If you owned one of these labels, you had the right to buy an item later, at the price printed on the tag, even if the true cost had risen or fallen. Some called it a game, others a riddle. One day, a man named Roland entered the shop. He had heard of these labels, convertibles and warrants, they were called, and he was curious. The shopkeeper, an old woman with eyes like cloudy glass, offered him a cup of tea and said, "You don't pay for what the tag says. You pay for what you believe it will be worth." Roland raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the same?" She shook her head. "No. One is price. The other is imagination." Benjamin Graham, in chapter 16, takes us into this strange little shop of the market where financial instruments like convertible bonds and warrants live. They are often misunderstood, often admired, and often dangerous when used without clarity. Convertible bond is a kind of chameleon. It begins life as a bond, promising regular interest, a defined maturity. But it holds within it a whisper. If the company's stock soars, you may exchange me for shares. In this way, it offers security on one side and opportunity on the other. A warrant, meanwhile, is more direct. It is a right to buy stock at a set price for a fixed time. It doesn't pay dividends. It doesn't mature. It just waits, like a silent promise. These tools can be useful. They can also be deceptive. Graham does not dismiss them outright. Instead, he encourages us to look beneath the glow, to ask who benefits. Often, convertibles and warrants are issued not to reward the buyer, but to serve the issuer, to raise capital, to boost interest, to seduce those drawn to best of both worlds offers. The problem, Graham notes, is not with the tools themselves, but with how we perceive them. We see the upside, but not the terms. We imagine conversion, but forget the limits. We hold a tag in our hands and think, surely this will be worth more soon. Back in the shop, Roland picked up a tag labeled Golden Future 45. He studied it. "So I can buy this at 45 no matter what?" "Yes," said the shopkeeper, "but only until the moon leaves Scorpio. After that, it vanishes." He frowned. "That's oddly specific," she smiled. "So is the market." This gentle absurdity carries Graham's point. Warrants and convertibles are real. Their terms are real. But so are their limits, their expiry dates, their fine print, and their often overestimated value. As with so much in investing, the danger lies not in the product, but in the assumption. Tonight, as your thoughts soften and the world quiets around you, imagine yourself in that shop of shifting labels. The shelves stretch high, the prices blur in the candlelight, and perhaps you hold one such label, a promise of future worth. Ask yourself softly, do I understand this promise, or am I holding imagination? In that question lies all the wisdom you need, because sometimes the key in the lock turns smoothly, and sometimes it was never meant to turn at all. Chapter 17, 4 extremely instructive case histories. The 4 portraits in the attic. In a quiet manor house that stood on the edge of a sleepy harbor, there was a room no one visited often. The attic. But in that attic, hung on a crooked wall just above an old cedar chest, were 4 portraits. Each painting captured a different man, each with a different gaze, a different posture, a different story. The first was painted in sharp detail, a man of presence, dressed in fine clothes, his hand resting on a stack of books and reports. His eyes glimmered with pride. Below his frame was a small brass plate that read, "The Promising One." The second portrait was more subdued. The man wore modest clothes, but his hands were stained with ink and his coat frayed at the cuffs. He looked outward with calm confidence. His plate read, "The Quiet Builder." The third painting was noticeably different. Rushed, almost chaotic. The figure was blurred, his face half turned as if in motion. Bright colors swirled around him. Red, gold, and black. His plate, surprisingly tarnished, read, "The Meteor." And the last portrait was faded. Time had cracked the varnish. The figure sat slumped in his chair, his face worn, his expression blank. The brass plate had fallen off, but a small note beneath the frame read, "He followed the crowd." Benjamin Graham, in chapter 17, brings us something rare, real-life case histories. He presents 4 companies and their stories, not to shame or dazzle, but to instruct. These are not triumphs or disasters told for drama's sake. They are patient observations of human behavior, of market response, of outcomes that rose and fell according to timeless patterns. Each company represents a kind of investor experience. The Promising One dazzles with potential. At first glance, everything looks aligned. Strong reports, good leadership, great publicity. But the price, oh, the price. It runs ahead of value. Expectations inflate. And like the man in the portrait, pride takes over. Reality can't keep up. And eventually disappointment follows, not because the company failed, but because the expectations were too high. Then comes the Quiet Builder, a company that earns steadily, doesn't attract attention, pays its dividends, avoids excessive debt. Its price doesn't spike, nor does it fall dramatically. Over time, it rewards the patient, not with stories to brag about, but with peace. The meteor burns brightly, a hot stock, a turnaround story, or a speculative favorite. Its path is fueled by energy, rumor, momentum, and then it fades, fast, often because there was never much there to begin with, just heat, not light. And finally, the most haunting one, the crowd follower. This is the company that mimics trends, merges with others to chase fads, shifts strategy midstream, and ultimately gets lost. Investors in these companies often say, "But everyone else believed in it." And yet following the crowd doesn't anchor you. It only sweeps you away when the tide turns. Graham does not name these portraits as such, but his histories draw them clearly, and in sharing them, he reminds us of something deeper. Investing is not just about numbers. It is about temperament, about how we respond to stories, to news, to movement. Sometimes we need to see things not in theory, but in lived experience. So tonight, Imagine yourself wandering through that attic. The air is dry, the floorboards creak, and before you are 4 quiet lessons, hanging in golden frames. No one else is there. No market noise, no tickers flashing. Just you and time. Perhaps you ask yourself, which portrait reflects my habits, my instincts, my hopes? And perhaps you leave the attic not with a new strategy, but with a steadier heart. Because history, when listened to gently, tells us not what will happen, but what often does. And that sometimes is enough to sleep on. Then let us continue softly into chapter 18, where Graham offers not a toolkit, but a lens. Not the mechanics of trading, but the art of seeing clearly. Here we are asked not to become experts in finance, but observers of pattern, reason, and rhythm. Chapter 18. Security Analysis for the Lay Investor. The dusty ledger, in a forgotten wing of an ancient library, a place where dust settled like snowfall and the air smelled of old ink, a young woman named Lyra discovered a thick, leather-bound ledger. It had no title on the spine, no golden letters, only a torn ribbon dangling from the binding like a question. She opened it out of curiosity, expecting poetry or family records, but what she found were rows of numbers, hand-drawn tables, and quiet annotations written in a tidy hand. Debt to equity remains steady. Margins improved modestly. Earnings reliable, though unspectacular. Lyra didn't understand it all, at least not at first, but the more she read, the more she noticed a pattern. This wasn't just accounting, it was a story. A company's life told through cautious steps, occasional leaps, and long pauses. And with each page, she began to hear a quiet voice, not the author's, but the company's. This is who I am, not what I've proven. This is the kind of analysis Graham introduces us to in chapter 18, not the technical charts of traders, not the rapid-fire forecasts of television pundits, but something gentler, older, and more human, the ability to understand a company's soul by listening not to what it says, but to what it shows. Graham believes that even the ordinary investor, someone without access to expensive research or insider calls, can perform basic security analysis. All it takes is patience, a few tools, and a calm heart. He outlines what matters most: consistent earnings, a strong balance sheet, manageable debt, conservative accounting, and a price that does not outrun the company's value. He urges us to read financial statements not like cold ledgers, but like biographies. Each line tells a story. Revenue speaks of reach. Expenses speak of discipline. Debt speaks of risk or desperation. Dividends whisper of confidence. And over time, the patterns emerge, not in days or quarters, but in years. Lyra, in her quiet library, began copying the ledger by hand into her own notebook. She would read a company's report and next to it sketch small symbols. A tree for growing earnings, a candle for stable cash, a cracked jar for rising debt. It wasn't scientific, but it was attentive. She wasn't trying to predict, she was trying to understand. And that, Graham would say, is enough. Understanding, awareness, the slow gathering of truth over time. Security analysis, when done this way, becomes an act of mindfulness. It slows you down. It pulls you away from headlines, hype, and hurry. It brings you back to the source. What is this business really? What has it done? Not what is it talking about doing? Is it steady? Is it sensible? Does its price make sense in light of its past? It is not about perfection. It is about discipline. And discipline, practiced gently, becomes clarity. So tonight, picture yourself in that library. There is no urgency, no noise, just paper, candlelight, and the quiet honesty of numbers doing what numbers do best, revealing patterns, not making promises. And as you close the book, you do not say, "I know the future." You say something softer, more lasting. "I see what's real." Chapter 19, Margin of Safety. The central concept of investment. The bridge and the wind. There was once a builder named Avon who was famous not for the beauty of her bridges, but for their resilience. Her bridges weren't the tallest or the most elegant, but year after year, storm after storm, they stood. While others buckled, bent, or cracked, hers held steady. People would visit from distant towns to see her at work. They expected secrets, hidden materials, complex math. But when they asked how she did it, Avon would simply smile and say, "I don't build for the calm days. I build for the wind." What she meant was this: every beam she laid, every bolt she fastened, she left space, a margin. The cables were stronger than needed, the pillars deeper than the river required, the width a little more than the traffic demanded. Not because she didn't trust her measurements, but because she understood something essential. Life is not exact. This, too, is the heart of Benjamin Graham's teaching. The margin of safety is the space between what you pay and what something is truly worth. It is the buffer that protects you from what you cannot predict, from recessions, from recessions, from mistakes, from yourself. When you buy a stock or any investment at a price below its intrinsic value, you leave room for things to go wrong, and some things always do. No analysis is perfect, no model sees everything, but if you've left a margin, if you've paid 70 cents for something worth $1, then you've given yourself a cushion, a place to land if the wind shifts. This idea isn't exclusive to finance. It lives in every wise life. The traveler who leaves early in case of traffic. The cook who keeps a little water aside in case the soup thickens too much. The parent who listens twice before answering. Avon the builder once watched a younger engineer construct a bridge across the same river. It was sleek, minimal, efficient, a marvel of modern design. "No room for waste," he said proudly. Avon only nodded, and when the rains came that spring, it was her bridge, wider, heavier, older, that still stood when the waters rose beyond prediction. In investing, the temptation is always to stretch, to maximize, to push every dollar to its limit, but Graham warns us, the absence of a margin is not strength, it is fragility waiting to be exposed. The margin of safety is not just a buffer, it's a mindset, a form of humility. It says, "I may be wrong. The world may surprise me. Let me prepare for that, gently." Tonight, as the world outside quiets and the numbers fade from your thoughts, imagine yourself crossing a bridge. It is not the most beautiful, but it is solid. You feel its strength in each step, and when the wind picks up, as it always does, you do not hurry, you do not fear. You keep walking, slowly, because the person who built this bridge built it for this moment. That is what Graham offers us. Not certainty, not fortune, but steadiness, room, patience, a bridge with space for wind. And in that space, sleep can finally come. And now we arrive at the final chapter, chapter 20, not a crescendo, but a soft landing, not a call to arms, but a closing of the notebook. Here Graham gathers every thread, not to tie a bow, but to remind us that investing, like life, isn't solved, it's approached. With care, with thought, with rhythm, and always with respect for the unknown. And now we arrive at the final chapter, chapter 20. Not a crescendo, but a soft landing. Not a call to arms, but a closing of the notebook. Here, Graham gathers every thread, not to tie a bow, but to remind us that investing, like life, isn't solved, it's approached. With care, with thought, with rhythm, and always with respect for the unknown. Chapter 20. To sum up, the guidepost, not the map. The clockmaker's bench. In a small coastal village where fog rolled in each morning like a second tide, there lived a clockmaker named Elias. His shop was narrow and filled with time, not just the ticking of clocks, but the soft weight of it. Some clocks had golden faces, some barely worked, but each one Elias treated with equal patience. He never rushed a repair, never made claims about precision. When asked how he worked, he would say only, "I listen more than I fix." Near the end of his life, a young apprentice asked him, "What's the most important part of the clock?" Elias didn't answer right away. He placed two clocks side by side. One was ornate, polished wood, golden gears, a masterpiece. The other, plain and worn, ticked softly with a faded face. "They both keep time," he said, "but only one reminds you to breathe." The apprentice blinked. "I don't understand." Elias smiled. "That's because you're still looking for rules. But what you need is rhythm." That is what Benjamin Graham offers in chapter 20. After nearly 300 pages of definitions, comparisons, ratios, and returns, he leaves us not with formulas, but with rhythm, a reminder that investing isn't about chasing what's next. It's about returning again and again to what lasts. He brings us back to his core principles. Be an investor, not a speculator. Know your risk. Respect value. Insist on a margin of safety. Ignore the crowd. And perhaps most importantly, master yourself before you try to master the market. Because investing is not a test of intelligence, it is a test of temperament. Like Elias at his bench, the great investor does not fix every gear. He watches, he waits, he listens. He does not overpolish. He does not try to out-tick the other clocks. He simply keeps time, his own time, faithfully. In this final chapter, Graham is not handing you a toolkit. He is handing you a mirror. He is asking, do you know yourself well enough to walk slowly while others run, to doubt when others cheer, to hold when others flee? Because in the end, investing isn't about finding the next winner. It's about staying in the game. It's about building something that holds steady year after year, through storms, surprises, and silence. And so tonight, as we close the book, let us do so not with urgency, but with stillness. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a windowsill. Let Graham's voice, so old, so calm, echo softly in your mind. You will be right more often than you are wrong if you invest with discipline, patience, and humility. No more strategies now. No more numbers. Just the quiet tick of a clock that reminds you to breathe, and the comfort of knowing that time, like markets, rewards those who listen. That completes our long-form, sleep-friendly narrative journey through The Intelligent Investor